Hi, Year 3 and 4. I'm going to be reading the story of Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie and this beautiful pop-up book version, which is created by Robert Sabuda. There's the first page showing the City of London. There is one child who won't grow up. Most children do. The way Wendy knew she would grow up was this. One day when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden and she innocently plucked a flower and ran with it to her mother. Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" Wendy was the eldest, then John, then Michael. Of course they had a nurse. As they were poor, this nurse was not a person, but a Newfoundland dog called Nana, and she proved to be quite a treasure. Wendy one morning made a disquieting revelation. Some leaves of a tree had been found on the nursery floor, which certainly were not there when the children went to bed. Mrs. Darling was puzzling over them when Wendy said, "I do believe it is that Peter again." "Whatever do you mean, Wendy?" "It's so naughty of him not to sweep up after himself," Wendy said, sighing. Wendy explained that Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night and sat on her bed. "My child," her mother cried, "why did you not tell me this before?" "I forgot," said Wendy lightly. She was in a hurry to get her breakfast. Certainly Wendy had been dreaming, Mrs. Darling thought. There could not have been a boy in her room. The very next night, all the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off, and Mrs. Darling had bathed and sung to them. All were so safe and cosy that she sat down by the fire to sew. Then her head nodded, and she was soon asleep. Just then, the window of the nursery blew open, and a boy dropped onto the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light, which darted about the room like a living thing. It startled Mrs. Darling, and she screamed. It had to be Peter. Hearing the cries, Nana bounded in, back from her evening out. She sprang at the boy, and as he leapt at the window, Nana closed it quickly. Too late to catch him, but his shadow had not had time to get out. The window slammed and snapped it off. Mrs. Darling decided to roll the shadow up and put it away carefully in a drawer. The boy was gone, and they would dispose of the shadow later. The next week, Mrs. Darling put the children to bed and lit their night lights. But soon there was another light in the room, 1,000 times brighter than the night lights, looking for Peter's shadow. It was not really a light at all, but a fairy called Tinkerbell. And a moment later, the window blew open and Peter dropped in. So before I turn this page in to show you the little pop-up, we've got Nana bounding in, Nana the dog, and then we've got a little character at the top. I think that's Mrs. Darling, frightened by what she's seen. "Tinkerbell," he called softly. "Tell me, do you know where they put my shadow?" Tink pointed to the chest of drawers. Peter jumped at the drawers, and in a moment he had his shadow, but he could not attach it. He tried to stick it on with soap from the bathroom, but that failed, and he sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. "Boy," she said courteously, "why are you crying?" He rose and bowed beautifully. "What's your name?" he asked. "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she replied. "What's your name?" "Peter Pan." She asked where he lived. "Second to the right," said Peter, "then straight on till morning." "What a funny address," Wendy cried. "Is that what they put on your letters?" "Don't get any letters," he said contemptuously. "But your mother gets letters." "Don't have a mother," he said. "Oh, "Oh, Peter, no wonder you were crying," she said, and she got out of bed and ran to him. "I wasn't crying about mothers," Peter said rather indignantly. "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on. And anyway, I wasn't crying." "How awful," Wendy said. "It must be sewn on. I dare say it will hurt a little." She ran to get her needle and set to work. "Oh, I shan't cry," said Peter. And soon, with Wendy's help, his shadow was behaving properly, although a little creased. Peter was now jumping about in the wildest glee. He had already forgotten that he owed his bliss to Wendy. "How clever I am," he crowed. Wendy was shocked. "Of course I did nothing," she exclaimed with frightful sarcasm. "You did a little," Peter said carelessly, and dropped an acorn button in her hand. Wendy put it on a chain around her neck, and it was lucky that she did put it on that chain, for afterwards it was to save her life. "I want always to be a little boy and have fun," said Peter. Peter thought they had now talked enough, and it struck him that Tinker Bell was keeping very quiet. "I can't think when she's gone to," he said. "Tinker Bell," he called. Wendy's heart went fluttery with a sudden thrill. "Peter," she cried, "you don't mean to tell me there's a fairy in this room?" A sound came from the chest of drawers. "Wendy," he whispered, "I do believe I've shut her in the drawer." He let poor Tink out of the drawer, and she flew about the nursery, screaming with fury. I'll show you this pop-up of Wendy sewing. So we've got that beautiful bit of thread there. Before I turn the page. "She is quite a common fairy," Peter said. Intrigued, Wendy plied him with more questions. "Where do you live now?" "With the Lost Boys." "Who are they?" "They are the children who fall out of their carriages when the nurse is looking the other way. If they're not claimed in 7 days, they're sent far away to Neverland. I'm the captain." "Oh, if only I could see such a place. The stories I could tell to the boys," she cried. And then Peter gripped her arm and began to draw her towards the window. "Let me go," she ordered him. "Wendy, do fly with me to Neverland." She was very pleased to be asked, but she said, "Oh dear, I can't fly. I'll teach you." How could she resist? "Peter, would you teach John and Michael to fly too?" "If you like," he said indifferently, and she ran to John and Michael and shook them. Wake up," Wendy cried. "Peter Pan has come and he's going to teach us how to fly." "How topping," said John and Michael. It looked delightfully easy, and they tried it first from the floor and then from the beds, but they always went down instead of up. "I say, how do you do it?" asked John, rubbing his knee. "You think lovely thoughts," Peter explained, "and then it lifts you up into the air." Of course, Peter had been trifling with them, for no one can fly unless the fairy dust has been blown on him. Fortunately, one of Peter's hands was messy with it, and he blew some of it on each of them. Ooh, just had them pop up there. With the most superb results. They were all on their beds, and gallant Michael let go first. "I flewed," he screamed, still in mid-air. "I say," cried John, "we should all go out." Of course, it was to this idea that Peter had been luring them. Michael was ready, but Wendy hesitated. "There are mermaids and pirates," said Peter. "Pirates!" cried John, seizing his Sunday hat. "Let us go at once." "Come on," Peter cried imperiously and soared out to the window, flying off into the night, followed by John, Michael and Wendy. "Second to the right and straight on till morning." That was the way to Neverland. So we're going to close this beautiful page. We're going to have a look at the next one. There it is. Beautiful Neverland. There are the pages that I'm going to read. There might be more pop-ups hiding in there. "There it is," Peter said calmly. Wendy and John and Michael stood on tiptoe to the air to get their first sight of Neverland. They had been flying apart, but now huddled close to Peter. They were over the fearsome island, flying so low that sometimes a tree grazed their faces. "They don't want us to land," he explained. "Who are they?" Wendy whispered, shuddering. But he could not, or would not, say. They were the pirates, led by their feared captain. "Who is captain now?" asked John. "Hook," answered Peter, and his face became very stern. John knew of Hook's reputation. "He was Blackbeard's boatswain," John whispered huskily. "He's the worst of them all." "What is he like? Is he big?" Wendy asked. "He is not so big as he was," Peter said. "How do you mean?" "I cut him off a bit, his right hand," said Peter. "Then he can't fight now." "He has an iron hook instead of a right hand, and he has claws with it," Peter said. They flew on in scared silence. It was the stillest silence that anyone had ever known. To Michael, the loneliness was dreadful. "If only something would make a sound," he cried. As if in answer to this request, the air was rent by the most tremendous crash he had ever heard. The pirates had fired at them. The roar of it echoed through the mountains and seemed to cry out at them. And when at last the heavens were steady, Peter had been carried off by the wind. Of the shot far out to sea, and while Wendy was blown upwards with no companion but Tinkerbell. Tink at once began to lure Wendy, to her destruction. Tink was not all bad, or rather she was all bad just now, but on the other hand sometimes she was all good. Fairies have to be one thing or the other, because being so small, they unfortunately have only room for one feeling at a time. She was jealous of Wendy, who did not yet know that Tink hated her. And so bewildered and staggering in flight, Wendy followed Tink. The Lost Boys were out looking for Peter. The pirates were out looking for the Lost Boys, and the Redskins were out looking for the pirates, and the beasts were out looking for the Redskins. They were going round and round and round the island, but they did not meet at all because they were not going at the same rate. The boys on the island varied in number, but at this time there were 6 of them, counting the twins as 2. The first, Tootles, was not the least brave, but was the most unfortunate of all the gallant band. There's some Lost Boys popped up there. Next came Nibs, followed by Slightly, who danced ecstatically to his own tunes. Curly was 4th, and then the twins. The boys vanished in the gloom, and after a pause the pirates were on their track. In the midst of the pirates was James Hook. He lay at his ease in a rough chariot drawn and propelled by his men, and instead of a right hand, he indeed had the iron hook, which encouraged them to increase their pace. On the trail of the pirates came the Redskins. Every one of them had their eyes peeled. They carried tomahawks and knives, and their bodies gleamed with paint and oil. And bringing up the rear, the place of the greatest danger, came Tiger Lily, proudly a princess of the Redskins. They all passed a giant crocodile. The first to fall out of the moving circle were the boys. Rabbits could not have disappeared more quickly. Each boy retreated to the 7 large trees that they called home. Each tree had a hollow trunk with a hole as large as each boy. And the entrances to these homes were exactly what Hook had been searching for. "I do wish Peter would come back," every one of them said nervously. Meanwhile, above ground, Hook was plotting. "Most of all," Hook said passionately, "I want their captain. 'Twas he who cut off my hand." The captain brandished the hook threateningly. "I've waited a long time to shake his hand with this." "Peter flung my arm," he said, wincing, "to a crocodile that happened to be passing by." "I have often," said Smee, his boatswain, "noticed your strange dread of crocodiles." "Not of crocodiles," Hook corrected him. but of that one crocodile. That crocodile could have had me before this, but by a lucky chance it swallowed a clock that goes tick, tick, tick. And so before he can reach me, I hear the tick and I bolts. He laughed, but in a hollow way, and sat down on a large mushroom. Smee, he said, this seat is hot. And he jumped up. They examined the mushroom and tried to pull it up. It came away at once, for it had no root. And stranger still, smoke began at once to ascend. The pirates looked at one another. A chimney, they exclaimed. They had discovered the chimney of the home under the ground, and in their exultation they danced and sang. But they never finished, for another sound stilled them. Tick, 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 tick. It was indeed the crocodile. Hook stood shuddering, 1 foot in the air. The crocodile, he gasped, and bounded away, followed by his bosun. Let's Smee the bosun there. I think we're about to go underground to the Lost Boys' home. Hearing the noise once more, the boys emerged into the open. I have seen a wonderful thing, Nibs cried as he gathered round him eagerly. A great white bird is flying this way. What kind of bird do you think? I don't know, Nibs said awestruck, but it looks so weary, and as it flies it moans, poor Wendy. Wendy was now almost overhead, and they could hear her plaintive cry. But more distinct came the shrill voice of Tinker Bell. The jealous fairy had now cast off all disguise of friendship. Hello, Tink, cried the wondering boys. Tink's reply rang out. Peter wants you to shoot Wendy. Let us do what Peter wishes, cried the simple boys. Quick, bows and arrows. Tootles excitedly fitted the arrow to his bow. Out of the way, Tink, he shouted, and then he fired. And Wendy fluttered to the ground, with an arrow in her chest. Slightly was the first to speak. This is no bird, he said in a scared voice. I think this must be a lady. A lady? Said Tootles, and fell trembling. Now I see, Curly said. Peter was bringing her to us. Sorrowfully, he threw himself on the ground. A lady to take care of us at last, said one of the twins, and you've killed her. It was at this tragic moment that the boys heard a familiar sound. It made the heart of every one of them rise in his mouth. They heard Peter call. Peter, they cried. Greetings, boys, he cried. I'm back, he said. Why are you not cheering? They opened their mouths, but the cheers would not come out. Great news, boys. I've bought at last a mother for you all. Have you not seen her? Asked Peter. She flew this way. Tootles rose. Peter, he said quietly, I will show her to you. She is dead. Peter took the arrow from her heart. Whose arrow? Peter demanded sternly. Mine, Peter, said Tootles, on his knees. At that moment, Wendy raised her arm. She lives, Peter said. Peter knelt beside her and found his button on the chain that she wore around her neck. The arrow struck against this, said Peter. It saved her life. The boys told Peter of Tink's crime, and almost never had they seen him look so stern. Tinker Bell, Peter cried, I am your friend no more. Begone from me forever. Tink flew onto his shoulder and pleaded, but he brushed her off. Not until Wendy again raised her arm, and he saw that she would live, did he relent to say, well, not forever, but for a whole week. The next day, Peter measured Wendy, as well as John and Michael, who'd arrived safely for their new homes in the hollow trees. After a few days' practice, they would go up and down inside the trees as gaily as buckets in a well, and how they grew to love their home under the ground, especially Wendy. It was rough and simple, and not unlike what baby bears would have made of an underground home in the same circumstances. The rampageous boys gave Wendy much to do. There were whole weeks when she was never above ground. Wendy did not really worry about her father and mother, for she was absolutely confident that they would always keep the window open for her to fly back, and this gave her complete peace of mind. Now we're halfway through the story. There's little Tink and this beautiful pop-up of the tree. And I'm going to save the rest of the story for when you are all back in school together. And I can't wait for that. Have a lovely day.